Any suggestions for helping typical siblings relate with and have more parsimonious relationships with autistic siblings?
A good balance within the family is very important, I think, for families and for siblings, for parents of children on the autism spectrum. And so it's an area that's often faced by our families, and I know it's not an easy area to target. I think that from my perspective, there are different ways that one can do this, again, depending on what area you're really wanting to get at. I think one way to do it is to really involve the sibling in individual therapy if possible. Of course not all the time, but very, very short bursts when if a child is working with an individual therapist at home, to actually have the sibling join in for a short period of time on something very targeted, working at your child with autism's level, of course, and then providing the facilitation that the sibling will need to maximize success both for the child with autism and for the sibling. So it requires a lot of expertise and very clear thinking and a very good therapist to be able to do that. Another way that would be less intense would be to involve both children in something that would be highly motivating for the young child with autism, something fairly easy but that is not necessarily directly interactive. So I'm thinking like something like, both going bike riding along the bike path in Santa Monica. They're in parallel, they're enjoying the same activity, they're sharing the same activity, but you don't require direct interaction. Or another activity like going swimming together. So those are the beginning areas that I think are easy ways for a young child to involve a sibling of a young child with another child with autism. So really thinking about not necessarily direct interaction in some of the leisure activities that the family can be involved in.
What is the behavior that you want to see? Why is it not happening? And approach it from that model. Okay, this applies, the problem that we often face as clinicians is this need to put out the fires for families and for parents. And so they come to you and they say, can you help me with my child's X? So again, if you're talking about, if for example, what did the question say? What was it? It was harmonious relationships. So is it that the child with autism does a particular behavior that is maladaptive? Okay, if that's the case, why are they doing that behavior? What model did it come from? How can you intervene to help make that happen? This is up to you now. You can do this with the way that you think. And so I'm hoping that the person that asked this question is thinking to myself, okay, I know what the behavior is that's a problem. I can think about it this way, and I can help build that through the ideas that Tanya had suggested, coming from a very sort of developmental model, right?
Here's a controversial question, I think. I'm going to start by answering it, but then a few years ago I signed up my 3-year-old for the early intervention partial hospitalization program. Even though we had good insurance, this program was not covered. I faced several roadblocks and my son never benefited from your research. How do we regular folks who cannot afford a $1,000 a day program or 150 speech sessions make it happen? I'd like to answer that first because it's a really critical issue that we think about with a lot of the things that I do in neurogenetics. The patients that I see who are adults who have genetic disorders, they come from they're usually very poorly covered and everything. This is a national crisis. You have to vote. Vote with your pocketbook. Buy, I'm not, vote for, the issue is if you buy insurance, you should buy insurance that offers you the coverage because many insurances will cover these things. For example, even for the genetic sequencing I talked about, we've had no problem having that covered by insurance because it's cheaper than an MRI when it comes down to it. When part of it is that these insurance companies behave, I'm not saying all of them, but some of them behave very poorly. I would say probably illegally, they're probably really breaking the law. Of course, they would never admit to that in not providing services when they should. And it's a constant fight. And so, you know, unfortunately, that is a fight that we can help you with by like writing a letter saying, you know, here are 5 papers that support this particular treatment, and you know all the other insurances cover it. Why aren't you guys doing it, or something like that, to some extent. But you know, we can't spend days on that. I mean, that's unfortunately, and it is just a travesty of our healthcare system that we're not, you know, that all kinds of things people have difficulty with, and I think it would be very interesting in that, you know, from that regard, to have the autism community, let's say in California, vote on their insurance companies and who's providing what services, so that actually people would know what's being covered and what is good and what isn't. And we really don't know that as consumers. But the real issue is that the way that our country works, you're the consumer, you buy your insurance, or your employer does. If your employer is providing insurance and it's not good, then, you know, of course, you know, I work here, I don't have much of a choice. I get the insurance that UCLA gives me. Sometimes I'm not that happy with it. Well, we can get the faculty together at the faculty senate if that's an important issue and push it forward and, you know, complain and push back and say we want better insurance. And, you know, unfortunately, that's where we're left as people at one level. That's my kind of global issue. This is not specific to the ECPHP program or anything else. This comes across our clinical evaluations and everything that we try to do, both in the Autism Center and in, you know, in our genetics clinics. It's a constant back and forth. And so I guess one issue is that at some level, people are either willing to pay for it or not, like in terms of insurance or not, or, you know, do we want our government? I mean, it's really a fundamental question. Do we want our government, you know, do we feel that all children should have the, you know, medical care? And it is medical care. It's not anything but that. And the answer should be yes. And so if that's what we think, then we have to, you know, push that way. That would be my, you know, my strong feeling, you know, about it. You know, we can't, but I'm very, you know, and when I hear those kind of stories, it drives me insane, because there's some large insurance companies taking your money, invested it, made huge profits, and not giving your child the care. It's not the fact that the ECPHP or us don't want to kind of give the services or anything like that. You know, I think it really lies on the other end, the fact that now there's this middleman of profit that is sucking 30 or 40% out of the healthcare. Anyway, that's my political statement. You can complain in the evaluations if you don't like that, but this is a very politicized question here. This is not a, so I don't know if anybody else wants to add. I've stuck my foot in my mouth enough there. About 2 years ago, the University of Oregon has a brain awareness lecture series, because Portland is a very cool place and people are really active. So people actually pay, like they were going to ballet or something, for an 8-month, you know, once a month lecture series where they bring people in from outside. And I gave a talk in like the largest public auditorium, like a theater in Portland. And there was a guy there who I forget has a science TV show out of Portland, and he was fantastic in mediating this. The point is, we had a very long discussion because something like this came up where, you know, I don't know how I got off on this, but essentially in our country we have this issue that, you know, because there isn't a single payer, it's a direct consequence of this. The incentives are totally misaligned. If it's a medical problem, insurance pays for it. If it's education, it's in a totally different bucket. And everybody's trying to shift the bucket away from their bucket. If it were a single-payer health system, it would be the same government, the same everybody who's doing the education and everything. That would be the reality. And that's the problem, is either you stick laws in place that prevent the cost shifting, or you make, you know, but the issue is really the incentives there. And it's really a, you know, when you look at the Scandinavian countries, they do this right. You know, of course, they have their own problems. But they have aligned the kind of the medical and educational, psychoeducational needs of the child, because they realize they're all part of the same picture. Is it too much? Yeah. Anybody want to argue? No, I'm totally up for it. Yeah. No, I think this is a great discussion. Yeah.
Coming from a large urban school district, I think one of the things that we have not done as well is actually look at our research partners to see what they're doing. And we've worked a lot with Connie and trying to look at what is clinically based practice and what does that look like in a community setting. And so rather than, I mean, our families have so many difficulties not only accessing our services as a school district, but, you know, whether it's insurance, transportation, work schedule, I mean, the list goes on and on. So I think that whole accessibility issue is beyond large and not necessarily solvable with a single solution method approach. But some may think that what we can do in a community setting may be substandard to clinical work. At the same time, I think without even trying it, we're not able to create that ripple effect where more and more children are able to benefit from the really important and very vital and strong work that's happening in a research institution. So I think, you know, as simplistic as it is, the more we come together, the more kids we can actually be a part of.
I want to thank you for that comment, because I think it brings up the point of that, you know, we can come up with what is an idealistic, you know, super gold standard 99% treatment, but better to give 93% treatment and to kind of give the, you know, to kind of find a place where we can be out in the community in an efficient and cost-effective way, because that's what it's going to come down to in the end anyway. But thank you for that.
Well, as the MD working for an insurance company, partially why I came here was I wanted to learn more about the treatment things, and it's becoming more and more of an issue because legislatively, for example, we now need to cover a certain amount of ABA services, minimum I think $36,000, and it varies by state. So there's been much more involvement, and we do cover the services at the early childhood program. In fact, I used to review with the utilization people at your program. So, I mean, there has been some steps forward.
You should have a table out there, because your insurance sounds good.
Actually, I'm kind of the link between our medical team, which deals with the speech therapy and the occupational therapy and the behavioral health. So we are trying to become more holistic. But I mean, there are advances in really the way to do it. Some of it is legislatively, but some of it is the coverage that you buy. I mean, if you're gonna, because more and more of insurance is going to go into exchanges. So if you're going to buy a really bare bones policy, then some of the stuff won't be provided. But parity, there's been huge advances in parity. There's been huge advantage. I mean, like I said, that's why I'm coming here, because I've had more and more things with autism, and I expect even more. So I wanted to learn more about it. So, I mean, there are strides being made through all the lobbying and all the different things that you're doing. And your program is excellent. Like I said, it was reviewed for many years. So thank you.
In your study, did any of the 40 children who participated in the 5-year follow-up receive any intervention treatment during that time between the first intervention and the later follow-up? And is it possible that the treatment, the kind of treatment that they received during that time, would play a role in their follow-up performance?
That is an excellent question. And yes, actually, we did an analysis where we looked at the total, what we call the intensity of services. And of course, as researchers, this is actually a variable that's very, very hard to measure. What children end up getting outside in the community, what intensity that's delivered in, what the quality of that intervention is, that's a whole other set of issues. But what we did is we were able to, from the parent questionnaires that were filled out at the longitudinal follow-up, we were able, Steph helped me with this, do you remember running this calculation? We were able to just essentially put together what would be considered an average dose of intervention for each child across the longitudinal follow-up period. And we found that there really was no statistical differences between the 3 treatment groups in the total amount that they received. So, you know, we can't really say that the results, which is a good thing, the results that we found longitudinally couldn't be contributed to, say, the joint attention group just receiving more intensity of services over the period.
I was just wondering whether if there was a control group of children that didn't receive any, that didn't participate in your treatment.
Yeah, so we did have those 3 different treatment groups or group assignments, and one of which was that control condition. So we actually did follow them longitudinally. But remember, even the control condition was getting a pretty good service at the period of our intervention, 30 hours a week of ABA. So all children were getting intervention, but the control group just didn't get the augmented intervention.
EEG versus fMRI, what are the advantages of using EEG versus fMRI, technically and all that? And From my perspective as a dumb neurologist, I would say that the EEG has incredible temporal resolution, as Dr. Dessay talked about. You can find things in milliseconds. But the spatial resolution, because you're looking at the skull and looking at these electrical signals that are summing at the skull, is much less than the fMRI, where you can look deep into the brain at small structures. Yeah. Really? No, anything else? Yeah.
There actually is technology that's been developed here at UCLA by Dr. Mark Cohen that actually allows us to do EEG while someone is getting imaged. And so we can look at fMRI signal and EEG signals. Because, yes, the temporal resolution is in an order of milliseconds in EEG. It's not the case with fMRI, but the spatial resolution is not so good. You know, the issue, though, is in a dream world, we would do both to answer, you know, to say like with the implicit learning task we were talking about, it'd be wonderful to do that, look at learning in real time, and then look at which areas of the brain are actually activated in different groups, because there might be differences in response, but also in location, and the location is hard to really look at with EEG. The issue is feasibility, and we're often left with the fact that we cannot get fMRI data on some of our kids. And so we do the best we can with, the methodology of EEG, but in a dream world we do both.
The problem is that in fMRI you have to stay completely still.
Right.
And you have to
Sorry to mention that.
Or you can do it asleep. So practically we tend to see children in fMRI who are 6, 7, 8 and older, or are very, very young and can sleep through it. But when you start getting children in the 3, 4, 5 year old range and they can't sit still very well, then it becomes more difficult, and EEG is much more practical. I
learned a research result saying that some of the high-functioning autism children can outgrow autism. Is that true? Do you have any info regarding this?
There's actually a recent article Debbie Fine's group published just recently looking at, diagnostic stability over time, and I'd refer that person to that article. And it actually shows that, in using state-of-the-art diagnostic tools, there are groups of children that do fall off the diagnostic spectrum over time. And so in my particular study, I saw that. It was a smaller group of children, so it was only 5 of them, right? But I did see that, they met criteria for an ASD when they were 3 years old, and when we followed them back up, they no longer met that diagnostic criteria. In my talk, when I looked at the developmental trajectories over time by diagnostic group, I'm not quite sure if it was clearly conveyed that all 3 of those groups did originally meet criteria for autism. So at that follow-up time point, we did a re-diagnostic of those children and found that a small subsample of them no longer met criteria. And that was the group that you saw had the steeper trajectories and some of those joint attention skills over time.
How does that change your paradigm? Do you believe that that's a different classification of child that has a completely different disorder, some type of greater delay? Or do you really believe that child has autism? Which, if you believe all the genetic predispositions and all the connectivity that we just heard, and the variances in the MRIs, magically that switches on?
Not magically.
No.
Not magically. Yeah. Through intervention experience and
I would bet that a lot of it is related to the kinds of intervention. But when we think of disorders, one aspect of autism that is not part of the diagnosis, so strictly speaking, somebody can be severely autistic at age 3 and not at age 12, and they were definitely autistic at age 3, maybe at age 4, at 5, at age 6, and then at some point they started to, drift away, hopefully because, the diagnostic criteria for autism don't take into account the long-term life trajectory, which is a very interesting issue. And so then it's incumbent upon us, which is one of the greatest challenges, to see when we see a child at age 2 or 3, to try to tell the parents, give them some information about what the likely trajectory is going to be with optimal treatment, et cetera. And the problem is, we really, there are some things that predict aggregate group things, and we can make, generalizations, kids who have certain, amount of joint attention or a certain amount of language at a certain age may do better than others who show none, those kind of issues. And certain genetic disorders may have a worse prognosis, severe genetic disorders, and we can understand that. But I think our goal is to be able to identify biomarkers, whether they be EEG, electrophysiologic, or imaging, or genetic and behavioral, or maybe a combination that we can put together that will begin to allow us to do that. And that's kind of one of the goals of the research that we're doing at some level, is to improve that, not just to make a good diagnosis, but to be able to give as much guidance and information as we can. And, we're not there yet. We're definitely not there yet. There are we can show numerous examples of children who, before age 3, have this exact same mental age and kind of look very similar on all tests. I mean, of course, everybody's an individual, so they're different kids. And then, you look 5 years later and they look markedly different, even though they both may have gotten very similar intensive intervention. And we don't know what to, we can't now use that information to go back at age 2.5 and do a better job yet. But we're hoping that some of these biomarkers will allow us to do that. That's a huge challenge for the field, enormous. It's a problem, right? We can't, the trajectories can be widely different. But there are, kind of seat of the pants kind of rules about, people can fall into certain bins, like, better prognoses, more challenging prognoses, that kind of thing. But to really be able to predict in an individual is tough. So
do we have the technology to say that we are doing neural repatterning with this early intervention, that the early intervention strategies we're using is changing the biology and the structure of the brain?
Well, that's a really good question, and actually our new 5-year program is called Biomarkers of Treatment and Trajectories in Autism. So the answer is we don't really have those answers now, but we are starting to get enough good biomarkers between early behavioral stuff, between EEG and fMRI, that we can now start tracking these kids. We're tracking them from 6 weeks of age as we get them, and tracking them and following them to see if early interventions can change that trajectory. So we hope that as you come to these annual meetings in a few years, we'll start to get those answers for you.
And as you probably suspect, we have a strong suspicion that in many cases we will, we can. But, because...
And it's interesting because just, again, coming from the same, I mean, to keep going back to my talk, but when we think about children who we clearly can visibly see the connectivity problems that they're facing, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to change connectivity through behavioral treatment. There's a lot of questions to us constantly about things like biofeedback and things like the listening programs and these things that claim to internally change the way the brain connects using different methodologies. And I don't know if there's any answers to that per se, but I think people in the field are really trying to figure out alternative ways to, and it makes it hard on all of us because we don't know which one works and there's no data, but I'm just pointing out that there's a lot of different things in the field also where people are trying to change medical models or to change these types of things.
And I'll just add to that not in autism, but in other disorders, there are studies of drug interventions and other kinds of interventions where imaging has been followed over time to look at changes in the brain, and there are changes in brain structure and changes in brain function that we can measure with intervention, even in adults. Mm-hmm.
And to add to that, it's not necessary that the brain kind of normalizes. At some level, it may be using an alternative strategy. So we may see something like that. And so we're going to learn a lot about how the brain can work and adapt by doing some of these studies as well.
And what happens after traumatic brain injury?
Something like that. Maybe not as dramatic, but yeah, that idea, exactly.
Is there, in all the research that you guys have done, is there, I'm looking at it from a parent as having a second child, is there an average or is there a number out there that you guys have found with ASD in a first child and then the propensity for the second child?
Yes. Yeah, so it depends on the kind of sexes, it depends on the sex of the child and all that, but on average, it's going to be somewhere between 15 and, let's say, low 20%, so, you know, somewhere in that range.
Are you refining
And if there are 2 kids, it's much higher. It's almost 50%. It's over 40% if there are 2 kids in the family. You know, and so that's where the genetic testing comes in to refine, because certain kinds of mutations would make it so that the recurrence risk in the child is back to 1% or 1 in whatever the population risk is, because the mutation is kind of a random event that's caused the disorder. And we see that that's occurring more and more.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because from a parent's perspective, in the school districts, you're around parents that, obviously in the special programs, that have kids on the spectrum, so everywhere you look, you see, oh, there's one, okay, he's got a kid, that, oh, they have a second kid, and so from a parent inside out, you look at it like, wow, everybody has a second, or everybody has a third. You don't generally see a lot of, oh, there's only one, but there's a family of 5. Right? What you tend to see being in a school district looking at it is you see everything.
Yeah, no, and there's been some good published studies on this recently, you know, that again are relatively consistent. And so it depends on the sex as well. If the child is a girl, the risk is lower. If the child is a boy, the risk might be slightly higher than that. I mean, there are actually, you know, reasonable numbers for that.
Could you point me in the direction of that information?
I think that was published in the journal Pediatrics, and the lead author is Ozanov.
Ted and Marion have published on that as well. Ted and Marion's group has published on that.
They're all part of that Ozanov study.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I was just wondering if you could provide us with some information about some of the drugs that are on the pipeline. I know there's a couple of them that have been fast-tracked by the FDA, as far as I know. And also whether the efficacy of the drug is related to the age, as far as you know.
So they're not, as far as I know, you know, I'm privy to certain trials in like Fragile X, where they've been using a specific drug called an mGlu-R inhibitor, which is very specific to that mechanism. The hope is that that might be generalizable to other forms of neurodevelopmental disorder in terms of autism. I'm fairly certain it won't be to every autistic child, but there may, again, be certain subtypes where it is helpful. I'm not aware that they know anything about age effects. There is a relationship to the actual, you know, kind of genetic defect there is. There are a whole bunch of kind of drugs at the much earlier stages of development, attacking, you know, one of the issues is there may not be enough inhibition in certain circuits, and so there's certain drugs related to that. Drugs for tuberculosis, you know, this is a very big and kind of murky area, but there isn't anything that I would say is going to come out like shortly that, you know, when you say fast-tracked by the FDA, I'm not sure exactly what you mean, because I'm not aware.
For example, I read about the oxytocin nasal spray and the baclofen. I'm not sure. Is it baclofen?
Oh, baclofen.
Yeah, well, there are trials going on with those. The trials have not been completed, and as far as I know, I mean, that information is not publicly available at all. But they are, you know, so there's our baclofen, which again works in this inhibitory neurotransmitter way that I was talking about. A bunch of other drugs working on that, and the oxytocin, like I showed you in the mouse. Interesting, we can give the mouse it nasally as well, and it works, like in an eyedropper. So it's unclear so far, but there's a lot of hope. There's a lot of activity, but it's kind of not yet at the level of, you know, say anti-cholesterol drug pipelines or things like that. So,
I'm a psychologist in Central California, where we definitely have a shortage of services, and so I'm always trying to help people with that difficulty of access to treatment. And the regional center, I don't know if this is true everywhere, at least our local regional center, Asperger's kids don't meet criteria for service. So one of the things I'm hoping with our criteria change for DSM-5, I'm wondering how you feel. Do you think they're going to change that? Or is that going to help so that the Asperger's kids get to have access to some of the services that they've been ruled because they won't exist anymore, right? They'll no longer have Asperger's, right? if they'll be ruled out of services, or is, I mean, that's one of the things I like about the new criterion, is it
we don't
fall more.
Well, there wouldn't be, I mean, because there wouldn't be, as I talked about, there wouldn't be this distinctive categorization.
Right.
They would fall under the spectrum and be, categorized as high-functioning autism, or with the severity scores for each of the domains. So that's the goal, is that, these kids who maybe because of a label didn't get services, might now, I mean, I see it a lot with kids who have a PDD-NOS diagnosis don't get services because it's not thought to be autism. And now those kids, except for the kids, as I mentioned that one paper, the Kathy Lord paper, except for the percentage of kids who now meet criteria for social communication disorder instead of autism, but they also should get services, just more targeted services towards social communication. So.
Do you think that there's kids that don't fall into either category, that don't meet the social criteria for the autism spectrum disorder, but have the repetitive ritualistic behaviors, and they just kind of fall through both cracks? And I have kids on my caseload kind of like that. They're high functioning, but they have a lot of those ritualistic repetitive behaviors, perceptive behaviors, and then they have one of the social communication issues. And how is the new DSM going to meet the needs for those kids that kind of don't?
Right, and I think that, the consensus was that those are exactly the kids that we need to essentially study moving forward to see how many of those kids, fall into that category. In that Kathy Lord study where they studied about 4,500 kids, I think it was either 1 or 2% of the kids who no longer met criteria fell into that category of not meeting criteria for SCD or ASD.
10% is still a lot of kids.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. After the first 5-6 years, it looks like there's a certain curve that these kids will predictably go on. From experience or publications, is there anything at the adolescent level that intervention would change the curve? Or
so, it really
plasticity?
There's not a lot known. I mean, I'll say that. It's too bad Liz Lageson isn't here today, and Fred, because they've been running a program, a social skills program, usually for higher functioning kids, but for adolescents. And so Liz's program really focuses on adolescents. And I think Jeff Woods as well, some of the anxiety and other stuff, some of the stuff that he's developing in children, those kind of similar treatments can be used for social anxiety and just general anxiety in adolescents and young adults. So I think there are things that one can do that we know of and that we can kind of directly apply here. There are these programs that are going on that one can tap into that aren't too demanding in terms of time and all of that, and get the parents involved and working on it, and you can kind of bring it home and and do it.
Even Connie's peer study. Even Connie's peer study in the later elementary age, right? They're looking at intervening in social. You can talk more.
Going back to disseminating, so Dr. Kazari and myself and colleagues are now working to disseminate these models in public schools, working with school-age children, taking adaptations of what we now think of as JASPER, our intervention here, and modifying it for older children in kind of a peer engagement type of protocol, working with typical peers to support our children, and really working across elementary school ages. And even in high school, we have a study. So our group might be a good one. Michelle Dean is one of the students who is working with adolescents under Dr. Connie Kazari's.
I can add though, in August of 2012, AHRQ published a report looking specifically at research and programs available for adolescents and young adults with autism, and they concluded with a very comprehensive meta-analysis that less than 14% of all funding towards autism research has been targeted towards that group. So the reason that there aren't programs is because there's not the evidence base to support programs that work. And so I think, as Dr. Gashman said, this is where the advocacy groups have to advocate and say that the distribution of funding for research for autism needs to be shifted because autism is a lifelong condition and these children age into teenagers and young adults.
I think we've come to the end of our day. I want to thank you all for coming and giving us your attention and interacting with us. It's been really enjoyable. I've really enjoyed the questions, and I hope it's been a good experience. But if there are things that, we do this every year, and some of us obviously go out in the community and do many more talks, but we get together and do this. So if you have suggestions or comments or critiques, obviously, please do fill out the forms, and we do take them very seriously. Of course, it's a democratic process, so if you're the only one with the complaint, that may not get, but sometimes we've heard from a whole bunch of people the same thing, and that's kind of moved us where we are today. So thank you very much, and have a safe drive home. Yep.